Yeah, insofar as like people made bad investments because the Federal Reserve was handing out money like, free candy or whatever, uh, and they made investments in capital goods that aren't particularly useful, it would be good if those projects died because those projects represent like destruction of wealth. And so SVB is a good example of this. I'm glad SVB as a bank failed because every day they weren't failing, they were turning real wealth into basically nothing. They were shredding wealth.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Undoctrination. I'm Maggie.
And I'm Olivia.
And this week we are joined by a very special guest. Recently, many people on Twitter have pointed out that I am in fact not an economist. So we invited our colleague and friend, Peter Jacobsen. Peter, welcome to the show.
Maggie, it's a pleasure to be here, and you're a better economist than many economists I've met. So don't let them say that. Just because you don't have a piece of paper doesn't mean you can't be an economist.
I don't know if I'm better. I'm just very curious, and that's what the show is all about. Just for you guys to know, Peter is an assistant professor of economics at Ottawa University and the Gwartney Professor of Economic and Education and Research at the Gwartney Institute. He is also a colleague of ours at the Foundation for Economic Education and has an incredible plethora of articles on fee.org that I use regularly. And on fee.org, he has a series called Ask an Economist. So we invited him on today to do essentially a video version of Ask an Economist and ask him all of our burning questions and questions that we think are at the top of mind for a lot of young people.
Yeah, well, Maggie, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. You and Olivia both. It's a fantastic show, and I'm happy to be on it.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So I want to know, Peter, when did you first become interested in economics, and how did you decide that this was going to be your path in life?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was fortunate. I kind of discovered economics almost just, by accident. I didn't seek it out. And so I was always pretty decent at school, but had never found anything I was really passionate about. I was one of those people who could kind of get away with like last minute studying, last minute homework, and do decently well, get A's and B's.
Oh, I feel
that. That's so relatable.
Oh my gosh. It's the story of like a lot of folks, right? And then I came to my junior year of high school, and I took an economics course with one of the most difficult, teachers that I've ever had, Mr. Easterling. And Mr. Easterling had this great start off to class that I still remember. He was from the deep South, Alabama, I believe. And he had this Southern drawl, which I won't try to replicate because I'll make a fool of myself. But he started off class by telling us that everything goes back to economics. And he was a veteran, and so his example was math and science are the tools that we use to build bombs, but the reasons they're built are economic. And this like sort of fascinated and captured me that like all things that were related to human action and the things that people do ultimately can be sort of analyzed using the tools of economics. And I fought against a lot of the things that I learned in the class for a long time. He said, oh, people are rational. It's like, I want to say people aren't rational. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But it turned out the more I got into this course, the more I'm like, okay, all of these observations that economists make are actually pretty convincing. The logic is pretty convincing. And so this sort of captured me. And so I decided in high school that I wanted to go get a PhD in economics and be a professor so I could teach economics for the rest of my life because I just loved that basic course so much.
That's amazing. And what do you mean by people are rational?
Yeah, so another way that we could say this that makes things a little bit easier is that people are purposive. They act with purposes in mind. And so you have some sort of thing that you're pursuing when you take any conscious action, not like blinking, obviously, or your heart beating, but anytime you do something, you have something that you're pursuing. We could call that an end. And in order to pursue that, you have to sacrifice other opportunities, maybe some resources, your time. And anytime people do that, they are demonstrating that they believe, whether they're correct or not, after the fact, they might have to evaluate, but they believe at that time the sacrifices that they're making are worth the pursuit of whatever that end that they want is. That's what I mean, and that's what economists usually mean when they say people are rational. And so it's that kind of idea that people are pursuing the things they want to pursue, and this opens up a really powerful way of analyzing behavior.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, speaking of making sacrifices, I know that you are a professor at a university, so you interact with a lot of young people, and you were telling me earlier that actually your university is quite good with the student population in terms of them understanding economics and not having so much pushback. But I think a lot of the pushback against the free market that comes from young people comes from them not wanting to make sacrifices, right? I don't know what experience you have with that, Olivia, but it does seem
Uh,
like
a lot, honestly, a lot. And I've gotten a lot of flack from some of my close friends because I'm a college dropout. And to me, that was kind of weighing risk versus reward. I dropped out at a
mhm,
time when we were fully online. We had, I believe, a 10 to 15% discount from my full tuition, which was like living on campus and going to in-person classes every single day. And so it just wasn't worth it. It just wasn't worth it because I wasn't getting the same amount or even close to the same amount out of it. And I made the decision to essentially start my career 4 years earlier than I would have, and also start it debt free. And I did catch some criticism from a lot of my friends who are heavy proponents of forgiving student debt and canceling student debt. And essentially, the reason they didn't leave school and they didn't leave the online school that everybody agreed with was trash. Like all of my college peers and teammates, because I was on the wrestling team there, we all agreed that it was trash. But a lot of people argued for the sake of keep going, but also to kind of negate the risk and kind of protest in favor of not going through a risk to get to that reward. And that's just a common theme I see with a lot of other people in our generation. Peter,
mhm.
I know you're super young too, so you probably can relate to like whatever colleagues or friends or peers you may be around. But I find that we don't like risk, we don't like necessarily responsibility that the free market provides, and we do want a safety net. Not speaking like we as in myself, but generalizing a lot of the younger generation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Maggie, you had mentioned my students. What I think one of the advantages I have here at Ottawa University is a lot of our students are student athletes. And I think Olivia has talked about before, maybe not on the show, but I've heard
Mhm.
her mention that, especially like wrestling in her experience, is like very individualistic. So people kind of learn
Yes.
like personal responsibility, things like that. And I think athletics in general does that for students. Now, I agree, some sports
Yeah.
maybe more than others. But that sort of personal responsibility, accountability for your action, making sacrifices, all those things are pretty inherent in the process of like becoming an athlete, especially a college athlete. So it's not a totally crazy thing to propose to the students that in life there are trade-offs and you can't have always have your cake and eat it too. But I will agree with you, Maggie, that I do think one of the difficulties is that even though students sometimes make those decisions in their life, a lot of them have never thought about that from the perspective of it applying to, like, the government, for example. And so you don't often think about, well, when the government uses resources for one thing, those resources can't at the same time be used for something else. And so they don't think about trade offs applying to the government on that level. They just think of them in their own lives. And so I think this often leads to people having prescriptions for policies that they wouldn't follow in their own lives, even.
That's very true. And I kind of wanted to get into something that Olivia briefly touched on. So I was at like we were making matzo pizza last night with our friends, and one of them mentioned that they were hoping that the student debt relief would come in soon. And then that would, determine whether or not they were going to go to grad school next year. And
Oh,
I want
interesting.
to, yeah, I want to know, what are the conversations like around student debt relief and just student debt in general on campus? Because when I was in college, I think a lot of people were just happy that they were getting these loans. So at the time that I was in college, everyone was super happy about their loans, and that they were able to take them out. But as soon as college ended, that was where the oh no moment came in for them. And a lot of my friends that normally would be very pro free market are like, well, it would be great if we were to go and cancel these student loans and forgive them. So what is the conversation like that on your campus, and what is your response to your students?
Yeah, so I think, sometimes people are rational also means that they prefer more to less, and that includes money too. And so it is pretty, I think, universal, this idea that like the students do want the debt canceled. And I've even had conversations with students about like, oh, maybe I should take out more loans because I don't have $10,000 in loans out yet, and there's a chance that this is going to be like a free loan, right? Because you're going to get up to $10,000 back. And
Oh, good.
for so that
That just sounds like a disaster.
yeah, at a system level, this all falls apart, right? If everybody,
But it's
yeah,
understandable.
if everybody acted this way, this would be a terrible way to act. But it is understandable on an individual level that the loan forgiveness is going to be done probably via debt financing, and so the government's going to take on basically more debt in order to finance it, to displace the debt that's not getting paid back. And economists are pretty universal that debt means future taxes in one form or another. And so these students who, aren't taking out student loans right now, but who are sitting maybe on the cusp of taking them out, I don't blame them for wanting to take them out because they're going to end up paying for it, as well as us, in decades. But it's terrible because it kind of forces people or at least incentivizes them to take actions that they otherwise wouldn't, to take on investments they wouldn't otherwise do, go to school more, like was your experience. And anytime the government is forcing people to, or not forcing, but incentivizing rather, people to do one thing instead of another, they're making them make sort of permanent investments for these like temporary benefits. So it's just a really bad system for the long term.
Definitely. Yeah, go ahead,
Sorry.
Olivia.
I was just going to say, I think when we stop treating everything in life as an investment towards your future, then that's where things go awry. Even things that are not financial investments, something, if I work out today, that's an investment in my future, right? If I eat healthy today, that's an investment into my future. So when I'm paying tens of thousands of dollars to go to school, I expect a return on that because my degree or my experience in college is going to get me a job that's going to get that return. But so many people don't see the value of investment and return, and that goes into choosing the majors that they know will not provide a great return. And that's fine if you have the money to fall back on, or if you're planning on doing something else and just having that major because you wanted to learn something. But so many people do not realize that, and I see so many people complain about their useless degree. And maybe it's not necessarily useless, but there's not enough demand for it. Maybe an oversaturated market. I see so many people going to school now for like psychology. It's such an oversaturated market. I know every other person is a therapist. So
I know.
It's not useless, but it's not useful to the market at this moment. And it's just not a sound investment. And I often see people victimize themselves. And there's a lot of racial undertones that go, oh, Black women carry the most student debt. Native American women, it's very broken down into like intersectionalized boxes and see who suffers the most because of this. But at the end of the day, shouldn't we, in my view, I think we should provide more education on investment when you're in high school. And it's honestly abhorrent to me that we trick 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds into taking on $100,000 in debt and don't tell them that this is a direct investment into your future. If you don't do the calculations and see, okay, what's the average salary for a graduate with this degree? What am I going to make 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line? And you don't sit them down and do that, I think it's a great disservice to them.
Yeah, and unfortunately what we do is we disincentivize people who don't follow those tracks, who don't take out the degrees that are not useful for the market. And so the people who are going to bear the brunt of student loan forgiveness are like blue-collar workers who went to trade school, they didn't take out loans. They're going to have relatively high-paying jobs because those trade school jobs are actually relatively high-paying. But that means they're going to bear all the taxes and get none of the benefit, right? And so we're actively disincentivizing that good investment mentality, and we're creating what economists call a moral hazard, which is when you kind of subsidize risk by, in this case, offering a bailout for student loans. People are more likely to engage in the risky behavior, like taking out really large government loans. If you think you're going to get bailed out, there's more incentive to do it.
Yeah, and speaking of moral hazard, so we did an episode on the Silicon Valley Bank failure. I think it was released last week, but we utilized your article on why we shouldn't bail out bad banks quite a bit, and you mentioned moral hazard in that article. Could you explain just briefly how that relates to the Silicon Valley Bank failure?
Absolutely. So the example I use in my article is like, imagine we live in a world where every car accident is 100% reimbursed by the governments. if we live in that sort of world, how careful are people going to drive? You might say, well, people are still going to protect their lives. That makes sense. But everyone's going to be a little bit less careful when they drive. And there's lots of studies on different topics like this that confirm it. Even like scientific studies of they'll put a helmet on a biker and they'll have a biker without a helmet and they'll track the eye movements of both. And a biker without the helmet is more careful with where he keeps his eyes. The biker with the helmet's going to be more distracted. Seat belts are the same thing. If you wear a seatbelt, you're going to drive a little bit more recklessly. And so all of these are examples of moral hazard. Now, it's not always a bad thing to engage in protecting yourself. There's a cost and benefit. The benefit is the protection. The cost is you're going to be a little bit less wary of the negative outcome. And so when government engages in this process of offering bailouts, you have to think about the risky behavior they're encouraging and whether the risky behavior is worth it. And so is it worth it to bail banks out to encourage this behavior from banks that they can make their financial portfolio whatever they want? They don't have to worry about depositor funds. They don't have to consider risk, things like that. And the answer is straightforward: no. All of the things that Silicon Valley Bank engaged in were negative actions that actually destroyed the wealth of depositors. And by engaging in this bailout process of the depositors, the government encourages more banks to do this because there's no downside. Your depositors are still going to come out fine. Maybe you'll lose some investment money. The investors on Silicon Valley Bank did end up losing some money, but they were able to take out big bonuses before too. So it turns out they didn't lose at all.
Of course they were.
And so it really creates this bad system where both banks and depositors no longer have any incentive at all to care about the risk if you're a sufficiently large bank, at least.
Yeah,
it's
and in your article,
disgusting. Sorry.
yeah, in your article, you mentioned that we shouldn't be bailing out depositors either. And many people might say, "Oh, well, that's so cruel. How could you not bail out the depositors that, were tricked by this bank into making a bad investment?" And what would you say to that?
Yeah, so whenever you do business, especially when you're doing business with millions and millions of dollars, and you entrust your money somewhere, you need to have an incentive to check on whether that place that you entrust your money is safe or not. And people do this with investments all the time. You don't put your money. Someone calls you up and says, "Hey, I'm going to double your money tomorrow." You say, "Sorry, no thanks. Sounds too good to be true." And Silicon Valley Bank was, taking similar actions that were risky. And depositors need to have an incentive to check that out because, by the way, if depositors don't have the incentive to make sure their money is safe, then no one's making sure the money's safe, right?
Yeah, the banks don't have an incentive.
That's
either.
right. If the customers don't care, the banks aren't going to care either. And so, I am in favor, by the way, of the depositors being, given the insurance that was owed to them, which, by the way, the FDIC insurance policy is $250,000. That was the maximum. But you had a lot of people, a lot of companies shoving tens of millions of dollars into this one bank, into like a single deposit and thinking, oh, it's going to be fine. No, we need to incentivize things because if we always do this bailout, the incentive will never come. The moral hazard will always be there.
What's really interesting is their deposits tripled over a very few year period, and this was during the period of COVID. So there was a lot of money being pumped into the market, and a lot of the depositors for SVB were startups. And do you think in these high inflationary times that's when we see the prevalence of a lot of these high risk startups?
Yeah, absolutely. And even, the Federal Reserve actively with their policies was basically encouraging this result that there was going to be more money in the economy. M2 increased something like 40% over 2 years. And so M2, that's one of the measures of the money supply. There's several measures, but one way to measure it is with a measure called M2. And that increased by 40% over the 2 years in COVID. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve wanted to be careful to not incentivize banks to engage in too much investment either. So this happened to a lot of banks. Their deposits sort of ballooned over this time period because of like a combination of a bunch of new Fed tools that were being used. And so, yeah, this is a direct result. And in fact, not only was the ballooning of deposits, but the specific actions SVB took, which were so deleterious to the health of the bank, was they were buying government bonds. And one of the reasons they were buying government bonds is because the interest rates were low and they were expected to continue to be low. In fact, the Federal Reserve, who was one of the agencies responsible for kind of monitoring the health of SVB, they didn't even consider interest rate risk, which is the risk that interest rates are going to go up, in their projections about the risk for SVB.
You're kidding.
No, yeah. So they didn't
'Cause
they
it
didn't even consider the possibility we're going to raise interest rates, because they thought, well, we're in control of interest rates, and so we're not going to worry about them going up. Well, turns out the Federal Reserve can't force interest rates down forever because inflation happens. They let the interest rates rise.
Yeah.
The bonds that SVB was holding fell in value.
Yeah, because it seems from, hindsight is 2020, but it seems pretty obvious that if you're pumping money into the economy at that rate, and interest rates are that low for that long, that eventually it's going to start catching up with you, and inflation is going to get out of hand, which it did. Right? It's not as nearly as bad as some other countries. I know in America, we were all freaking out because gas in Atlanta hit like $5 a gallon. And that blew my mind. It was even worse in a lot of other countries. But yeah, it seems pretty obvious that, okay, if we're pumping a lot of money into the economy, that's going to cause inflation. And then we're going to have to rein it in a little bit. Do you think it was unwise for SVB to not take that into account, or?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, they had way too much money put into these government bonds. I mean, more than most banks, which is why they're having the big problem, and other banks didn't have as big of a problem. But on some level, it is hard to blame banks. Ultimately, I do lay the blame there, but banks are constantly talking about how these like treasury, bonds, treasury notes, government debt, it's risk-free, right? Because the government's going to pay its debt back. And in one sense, yeah, it's true the government's going to pay its debt back. But the problem, which I kind of already alluded to earlier, is when interest rates are really low and you buy a government bond, that bond is promising you a return that matches the really low interest rate. And the value of that bond is determined by that return. But then when interest rates start rising on everything else, well, no one wants your dinky bond with the low return. They want the higher return interest rate things. And so those things plummet value. Now, the bank should have been aware of that, but the fact that the Federal Reserve was pretending like, or not even considering the possibility that they were going to lose control of the financial situation, it was definitely a mixture of bad incentives created by the Federal Reserve and bad decisions by SVB and the owners.
Yeah, it's really sad to me to see. I mean, everyone on this podcast understands that a centrally planned economy is bad, but it's another level to just see how incompetent they were, because it just seems like common sense to warn them about this risk. And even Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, I believe it was the Sunday after there was the run on SVB, she even warned. She was like, okay, we learned from 2008, we're not going to bail them out again. Then about 3 hours later, the Federal Reserve announced that they were bailing them out. I don't even know why Yellen said that, if she knew they were going to do that. But we know that they're aware of the issue. We know that they're aware of the consequences of bailouts because they said it with their own words, and then they went ahead and did it. Do you know why? Like, if they know that this is the consequence of their actions, why would they repeat those actions?
Yeah, so let me give you the steel man, the most powerful argument in favor of what happened from the government's perspective. And so the first note that they'll say is that we didn't bail out SVB. And here's their argument, is that they didn't bail out the investors. They didn't bail out the owners. And so whatever people had in terms of value of the company itself, they lost that value in assets. It was allowed to be taken away from them. Now, what they did do is bail out the depositors, right? And so the kind of response to that is, well, you're still creating bad incentives for the depositors. So what the government would say, and even very smart economists who even though I don't agree with Larry Summers, who was, a former advisor to President Clinton, he tends to be pretty even-handed, and he's been very even-handed during COVID. He's been very wary of the, big inflationary period we've had. But even Larry Summers said something along the lines of, well, now's not the time to talk about moral hazard. And their concern is that if we didn't bail out all these companies who had their deposits at Roku, then a lot of companies would start failing. And if companies start failing, well, other companies are going to get worried, and they're going to pull their money out of their banks too. And this is going to trigger some sort of like nationwide bank run, lots of failures. And all the banks will fail if there's a bank run because they don't all have all the deposits in the safes. So the thought was, we have to do this now, otherwise we're going to have a big recession. The problem is, with the Larry Summers sentiment and the Janet Yellen sentiment, is if you don't allow these banks to fail, or excuse me, you don't allow the depositors to lose their lunch when there's an emergency, you're never going to fix the moral hazard problem, right? You can't just always say, next time we're going to let you fail, we're going to do it, we swear, and then every time bail them out. Again, people are rational. Nobody's that dumb. Depositors in these big banks know the FDIC is going to give us all of our money back. So why are we ever going to care about, if our bank is going to give us the good return?
Right. They need some tough love. And I don't feel bad for Roku at all, or any of the investors. I know there was Bill.com was in there, Etsy was in there, Roblox, a bunch of recognizable big tech brands. Roku had like almost $500 million. They know about the FDIC. They know that only $250,000 is insured. So they made that risk. They took that risk, and they should have paid for taking that poor risk.
Yeah, and let me kind of bring up one more like really bad incentive that was created from this. Is all of these big companies got their money back, and Janet Yellen went before the Senate, and I can't remember the senator, but a very astute senator asked her, so should we just consider going forward that all bank deposits are just going to be insured 100%? Like, is this the new status quo? Which is a reasonable question. If whenever there's a crisis, we're going to bail out, the Silicon Valley bank depositors of the world, should we just assume they're all going to be, totally insured forever? And Yellen said something that might sound comforting to people who generally like free markets, but it's actually even worse. She gave the worst possible response. She said that only in cases where the Federal Reserve and the FDIC and all these other, experts evaluates the bank as a systematic risk for the economy. The translation for that is, if you're a big bank, your depositors are going to get bailed out, but if you're a small bank, they're not. And so now all these companies like Roku or small town businesses or whatever, if you have more than $250,000 in deposits that you need on hand, which companies with payrolls probably need that much on hand every month, you're never going to bank at a community bank now. You would never bank in a small bank now, because that bank's deposits aren't going to be 100% insured. But every big bank, the Goldman Sachs of the world, those are going to be, because those are the systematic risks. So we just keep adding on to the too big to fail mentality.
That's a great point. And so you mentioned recession, the big R word. It definitely feels like we're coming up against a recession, although I've been feeling that way for like a year now. What exactly is going on with the American economy? Where do you predict it's going to go in the next year or so? And yeah, I'm confused.
Yeah, so you always need to be careful, and not you, but just economists in general. I think it's a wise idea to be careful about predicting recessions, and here's why. You can actually make a ton of money if you've seen the movie The Big Short, even though there's some problems with the movie and what it blames the financial crisis on. The story of the movie is true, that there were a group of people who made a lot of money off predicting the recession. And so anybody who tells you like a recession is coming, like the first thing you need to ask them is like, how much have you shorted the market? Because if they haven't shorted the market, they apparently know the recession's coming, but they don't want to get rich off of it. Which seems a little bit backwards. So anytime you know the future in the economy, you can make a lot of money. So anytime someone claims to know the future, but they haven't kind of put their own financial portfolio on the line, it's cheap talk, right? And so I haven't shorted the economy or anything like that. I am not certain of the timing of the recession, but here's what I do know, Maggie, is that we had a period of about a year, in some industries more, in some industries less, where we were engaging in consumption still, but people were buying goods, and businesses were producing goods to a certain extent, but they were, producing some things but not other things, and they were using their capital. So we had this period of consumption without our usual amount of production, because there were lockdowns, a lot of people were home and stuff like that. Whenever you have consumption in excess of production, just think of your personal budget, listeners at home. When is it possible for you to spend more than you take in terms of your income? And there's only two ways to do it. You either have to borrow the money, or you have to eat out of your previous savings. And so during coronavirus, we did both of those things. We borrowed from the future, and we ate out of our current stock of capital, those goods in the economy that produce other goods. And now we're seeing all these problems with, people talk about supply chain issues. Well, of course there are supply chain issues. We were using parts of our supply chain without replacing them or without improving them, because all the improvements were locked down. They were not essential, right? And so that could translate into a market correction, which we would call a recession. It could also translate, and this is almost even a little more sinister, into just lower growth for a very long time. if you have a lower, 1% lower GDP growth for 20 years, the nice thing about interest rates is they compound, but also the terrible thing about interest rates is they compound. And so 1% growth lost, for 20 years, that's going to end up to be a very large number of economic well-being that we've left on the table because of our pandemic response. So it'll be one of the two. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, whether it's going to be a recession or whether it's smoothed over the next 20, 30 years and we're just a lot poorer as a society because of it. It's difficult to say which one, or probably some combination.
So what's the better outcome? Would you say just getting recession over with and trying to correct the economy the best that we can? Would that be the better option?
Yeah, insofar as people made bad investments because the Federal Reserve was handing out money free candy or whatever, and they made investments in capital goods that aren't particularly useful, it would be good if those projects died, because those projects represent destruction of wealth. And so SVB is a good example of this. I'm glad SVB as a bank failed, because every day they weren't failing, they were turning real wealth into basically nothing. They were shredding wealth. That's what happened to their bank. They shredded their depositors' wealth until they didn't have enough to pay back their depositors at any given time. And that can happen on an economy-wide scale if you allow a bunch of bad projects inspired by these really low interest rates that we had during COVID. I would rather the chickens come to roost now rather than later on those. And now, different people will be affected differently. And so it's hard to say, for the whole world, what is the best option? There's probably not a good answer on that. But in terms of the economy, I would rather these bad investments getting covered sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and we talk about this a lot, but the housing market, do you have any wise predictions? When can I buy a house, Peter?
I'm sorry.
He can't give us financial advice.
I'm light on the. I will tell you that I am currently looking for a house myself. So I guess what that implies about me is I don't think values are going to plummet very soon, and I don't think interest rates are going to return to normal very soon. Okay. That's my opinion. Yeah. Okay. But if I thought that interest rates were going to fall, I'd probably wait to buy a house a little bit, though, it kind of depends on the prices, things like that. But if anything, I'm actually kind of more worried about things moving the other way. I'm not convinced that we've quite beat inflation. Actually, if you go outside, the listeners know right now, as of recording, gas prices are back on the rise. So it's gone up 30 cents in the last week where I'm at. And so
so it wasn't just me, because I had to pay for gas this morning.
Yeah, it's all over. So I'm not convinced we're done with the inflation, which means we might not be done with higher interest rates either.
So the bubble has yet to burst, and we have some more bad economic decisions to make before that happens, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there might not even be a bubble here to the extent of there's no guarantee that our prices will return to what they were before. Another thing listeners should keep in mind when it comes to inflation is inflation is additive. So think of it this way. If you start off January and inflation is 2%, that means something that was $100 at the beginning of the year becomes $102 at the end of the year. If inflation is 0% the next year, that means it starts at $102 and it ends at $102. And so the price doesn't go back down ever with 0% inflation. 0% inflation means prices stay the same. And so we won't actually see lower prices unless we have negative inflation rates. We have deflation. And so periods of sustained deflation in the United States, very rare. Maybe we'll have a little bit, but it's more likely that what's going to happen is eventually, though not within, I even think, the next year, eventually our inflation rates will come down, but I don't think the prices are coming back. I could be wrong there. And again, I'm not putting any investments into this, but if I had to guess, I think they're kind of here to stay, with maybe the exception of gas, which moves a lot.
That's a harsh reality to face for sure. So we're never getting the 50s dream of a $50,000 house.
Yeah. Now the advantage is inflation is economy wide, and so some people will end up with higher paying jobs or whatever. But the problem is usually the price of goods and services increases before most people's wages, and so there's a transitionary period where everything's more expensive and you're not getting paid more. Eventually, people will get paid more to compensate for the higher prices. But that transitionary period really hurts a lot of people.
By the way, I want to go back to deflation. What kind of conditions are necessary for that to occur?
Well, a lot of times it would be like a recession would be something that, anytime that either there's two ways we could have deflation, at least according to like a standard like macro way of thinking, is that one is people could start holding money like cash. I don't mean like investments, but cash, and stop buying goods and services like on the whole. If people started doing that, you would have lower prices on the whole for goods and services. That would be like decreasing the demand of everything. It can't just be one thing, because if you decrease the demand of one thing relative to everything else, just the price changes of one good relative to another.
So Bud Light is not going to deflate
No,
the economy.
absolutely not. But the other thing that could happen that could lead to lower prices, and the thing that has led to lower real prices for most goods, because most goods are cheaper now in terms of the time it takes you to buy most goods, is way lower than it used to be. That's caused by increases in productivity. And so if you have really, really good technological or organizational improvements that lead people to be more productive than they were before, that's going to mean you're going to have a larger supply of all goods and services. And so the supply of all goods and services increasing through productivity increases, technology increases, better institutions, that can cause the real amount of time it takes to buy resources to go down. And so that's kind of the bright side.
Interesting. So speaking of productivity increases, people have been freaking out about AI recently. And it's understandable why people are always in fear of being replaced, but chatbot GPT came out like a few months ago, and I've incorporated it into my work. I know most people I know have incorporated it into their work, but I know that at the university level, this is a really big issue. So I was curious how your university is dealing with this, and later we can get to, how you think the economy is going to deal with the introduction of really intelligent AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a big concern in the university because students are, at least a lot of them want to cheat, right? So by having ChatGPT write totally original papers, you actually can't detect ChatGPT with like plagiarism detectors, the standard ones, because it's creating new contents. And so a lot of professors are worried about this. And I think because of how we've arranged our system, it's actually an understandable worry, that we've got this weird system where a lot of students feel like they need a degree to get a job, a high-paying job. So they don't want the degree for the sake of the education. But they also don't want to put in the work because they don't really want the education in the first place. They just want the piece of paper. And because we've created this system where we basically have a big certification process that's like masquerading as education, we have a lot of students who are willing to cheat. If students were interested in education for education's sake, this would not be a problem, right? If you really wanted to learn something, you wouldn't have ChatGPT write a 5-page paper for you. Yeah. But if you just want to get through the class so you can get your degree, you have an incentive to do that. And so higher ed's going to face a big problem on this front.
Wow. It's scaring me. I don't even want to go to the doctor anymore because I'm like, how do I know that doctor didn't just use like ChatGPT to skate their way through medical school? And I feel like, I don't know what you do with students, but I feel like we're going to see a lot more professors like suddenly pile on like pop quizzes in person and stuff to like, if you turn in an essay and it's great, it's a 10 out of 10, you better prove that in person in front of everybody, and you're not going to use ChatGPT. And I actually haven't utilized it that much. I actually used it for the first time this week. It was to write fan fiction. So yeah, I'm a nerd, but I have not used it for work yet. I might.
It's really nice. Like I type in, like I'll take notes at a meeting, copy, paste it in ChatGPT and ask it to like organize it for me.
Oh, that's
amazing.
Helpful.
Yeah, that's what I use it for, is like, if you don't want to do the tedious work of organizing, ChatGPT has got you covered.
Yeah, we should ask it for like podcast topics.
Or you can put in like a data column and say, well, what's the most recurring of all of these different things in the data column? It'll tell you the quantity in each column. I mean, you can kind of do some of these things on Excel already, but it's just a lot faster, right?
It's so fast, and it's like there are problems with it. Like if you ask it to give you quotes from a certain person, it's going to spit fake quotes at you. So don't use it for that. But it's been really fascinating. There's so many ways you can use it that are not actually like cheating or plagiarizing or asking it to just write something for you, but for researching and organizing thoughts and taking out the 80% from the 80-20 rule. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that. Like 80% of the work you can do in 20% of the time, and then 20% of the work is usually done 80% of the time. And a lot of times it takes out that really tedious type of work. So I love it for that. So I think productivity-wise, it's making people faster at doing stuff. I don't know that it's good enough yet to replace people entirely.
No, and
I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it ever will be either. So I maybe have an unpopular opinion there, but I think that the human touch will always matter to people. In terms of higher ed, though, I actually am kind of optimistic about its effect because higher ed is in such a, honestly, weird equilibrium right now. Like, the place that higher ed is settled is so bad, I think, that I almost welcome the shock. And so, like, a good example of this, you mentioned, like, in-person pop quizzes. It used to be how basically all courses ran, and I'm talking, like, hundreds of years ago, is you would teach someone over the course of a semester, and you would have the lectures and all that, and then you would bring a student into your room, basically, and ask them questions verbally. And they would kind of answer your questions or not answer your questions. These are oral examinations. They used to be very popular. And you would decide you either pass or you don't pass. And that's like the whole class. There's still, to some extent, like if you've ever had a final class where the final exam is an essay and it makes up most of the grade, that's kind of similar too. We're in a weird world now where like professors have like all these like gimme points with homework, and it already is sort of like a lot of fluff and fake stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think ChatGPT is mostly making that fluff obsolete. And so you're not going to be able to get away with as a professor, not that like everybody's trying to like minimize the amount of time they're working. There's lots of good professors, but there are some out there who just kind of want to skate by. You're not going to be able to put like, 90% of your grade is reading responses now, because everybody knows now ChatGPT can just do like any reading response you want. So
yeah, and just from my own personal experience, so I also didn't finish college. I had a 4.0 while in school, though. Not that GPA matters, but I loved school when I was in college, because I loved learning. Like, I loved being in class. I loved studying for the next class. I loved answering questions in class. I did get made fun of for answering questions a lot.
Me too.
For being the class pet. But it was so obvious to me that everybody else around me, or at least a lot of them, either thought I was like annoying for like enjoying being there, or just didn't want to be there at all, or both. And that really turned me off of higher education, because I absolutely like drank from the fountain of knowledge while I was in school. And that's why history classes, where it very much was, answering questions and explaining things, those were my favorite. But yeah, like if higher education changed for the better because ChatGPT made a lot of these like nonsense side work kind of things obsolete and just really focused on real education, I think that's a good thing. I agree with you. I welcome the change.
Yeah, and just I totally agree. It doesn't really matter about like grades and stuff if you drop out, because I think there's so many smart people who like failed classes and stuff. But to your point, I was on the dean's list. I enjoy learning. I can't say that I enjoyed school, which was a lot of the reason why I dropped out, because one, I had multiple professors that clearly had a bias against not even like clearly conservative thought, but just like capitalism, free market, historical facts that were just inconvenient to the left. I had one professor who basically called me a right-wing propagandist in front of the whole class. She was a white woman who wore no shoes and no socks to class every day. She was like the definition of a hippie.
And she was preaching in class.
She would flap into class on the linoleum tile floors every single day. But this white woman basically called me a right-wing propagandist in front of the whole class because I said that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist, and we had done this whole unit on the history of birth control. I don't know. This was U.S. history class. I don't know why we needed a whole unit on birth control. But we started talking about the American Birth Control League. She was founded by the hero, Margaret Sanger, da-da-da-da-da. She was a hero for Black and impoverished women. That's a direct quote from this white liberal professor. And I raised my hand and I was like, I don't think that's true. Like,
that was her intention.
She kind of talked about like getting rid of the undesirables, and she attended KKK meetings, and her co-founder of the American Birth Control League was Lothrop Stoddard, who was called the first American Nazi because he influenced Mein Kampf. Like, there's so much stuff so much stuff wrong with the founding of the American Birth Control League. I literally got called a right-wing propagandist, and I was on the dean's list, and I dropped out. I literally could not
Speak your
take
truth,
it.
queen.
And I do not regret for 1 second. At the beginning when I dropped out, I was feeling not regret, but just like very anxious about my future and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that it's absolutely not necessary to have a degree to make money or to have a good career. Last year I made more than the average computer engineer degree holder. And so I was like, okay, I don't know why I would go back to school after that.
Yeah.
So I'm just not going to. I mean, in the future, I would say if higher education changed and it was a place where people can go to learn and yes, have their ideas challenged, because I'm not against having my ideas challenged at all. It was just my ideas being shot down
Dismissed,
and completely dismissed and portrayed as propaganda that it was just awful. I don't know why anyone would pay six figures to...
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it was because I was a political science major. That's my largest embarrassment of life.
I was too. I was an economics minor, though.
See, that's where you went wrong. You were in the political science.
My focus was in public administration. Like, I literally thought I was going to be like a mayor or something. Like, I was really...
Oh my gosh,
Olivia.
I was a little delulu, but yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, no, and I think like ultimately this comes back to again, we're just kind of in a weird, and a lot of professors even recognize this, that we're in a weird spot where, like, I personally actually am still a believer in like liberal arts education. I actually think like learning a lot of things, and even things that are unrelated to what you think you want to do, is actually like valuable. And so I had to learn a lot of like mathematics. I had to learn how to do real historical research, not just like reading a history textbook, but real historical research to successfully do economics in grad school. Like, economics opened my eyes to lots of different fields that I previously didn't, like, I didn't care about math in high school. And so I think that's still really valuable for a lot of people. But it's not for everyone. I don't think everyone needs to and should take, liberal arts education for 4 years past like high school education. I don't think everyone has a one-size-fits-all path with education. Mm-hmm. And tying that to this idea that we need to do it to have careers, that's the worst possible, answer. And so I don't think it's for everybody. I do think it's really great. But I definitely don't think we as a society should decide that like degrees are the way that we need to gatekeep jobs. I think anymore, we're seeing more and more that this is just kind of a silly way to arrange things.
Yeah, and I love that in this field that I'm in, degrees do not gatekeep jobs. Like, I've never had an issue getting a job in this field or advancing because I don't have a degree. Actually, nobody asks me, which is...
I've only had one instance where it hindered me, and it did kind of piss me off. I don't know if I'll get in trouble for saying this, but like when I was like 19, I want to say I was really young. Fox Digital reached out to me over LinkedIn, and I went through probably like 2 rounds of the interview process because they wanted me to write for their website. And the lady was very nice, and she was like, "Oh, just one more thing. I didn't see where you graduated from on your profile." And I was like, "Oh, did not graduate from anywhere, actually. I'm 19 years old." Like, at that point, I'm pretty sure I still was, I think I still was enrolled in college, but I went through several rounds of the interview process, and that was like literally the one problem they had with me. And they literally said, "Come back in 3 years." And now I'm on Fox every week without a degree. I don't even think they made the connection, because Fox Digital is totally on the different side of things than Fox Business. But I just find it so ironic. And it's interesting to me that, of course, a lot of ideologues and commentators on Fox News and conservative media in general are telling kids, you don't need a degree, you don't need to get in all this debt, blue collar is the way to go. But still, a lot of conservative empires and corporations will not hire without a degree, which I find really interesting and kind of hypocritical. But back to your point, Peter, about higher education could still be very valuable because there are so many things you could just learn that may not even pertain to your job field, but like mathematics and philosophy and things like that. I will say that is true. I may even make the argument, though, that you can like arguably learn more online or in a library for free at your own like free will, I guess. But I guess it depends on people's learning styles. I will say that I saved myself $100 because I think every like class in college was like, if you broke it down by like the semester and my tuition was probably like $100. this is like a macroeconomics class I would have paid for in college, and you're teaching me for free.
Yeah,
So
I was going to say,
thank you.
Peter, there's a real opportunity and hole in the market that you should capitalize on and create your own show where you explain basic economics to people. I don't know. You could charge you
I'd
could
watch
charge
it.
some money for it. I'd watch it.
Well, it's one of those things where I think, Olivia, like the best model of higher education is the older model, which you went to university to study with someone. And that's like the one thing that I by the way agree that like people should spend more time in libraries. I think, by the way, like if you're someone at home and you're more interested in like learning, I recommend like go to your local library and read local history, because this is something like you won't find online, probably not a lot of people have talked about, but your local library is going to have it wherever you are. I think that's like a really interesting, like underutilized field of study. But the only thing you can't get from the library is like a person who is like a trained master who like you have a lot of respect for their opinion, and that's still kind of how grad schools work in the U.S. Like people apply to study with specific professors for grad school, but it's totally lost in undergraduate education. And yeah, we've replaced it with classes that, for the most part, like yeah, you could kind of do better on your own, kind of self-directed if you're motivated. So yeah, I agree.
College definitely feels like a factory, just to like designed to like get people through the courses, get the money. I really think government involvement in student loans has just completely screwed up college forever. Because now, I mean, colleges now have a profit incentive to make it as expensive and as long as possible for people, because they know that people can pay for it. And if everybody believes that, this is necessary to get a decent job, then I'm gonna take on that sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
I just think it's totally backwards. And
I'm
it's really sad to see fellow young people call for more involvement from the government in student loans, because it's just going to make this problem worse. And I understand that, we're all very self-interested. I get that. But think about your children. Think about the money you're going to spend in the future on their college education if you continually get the government involved in student loans, especially if they're getting forgiven. That's just going to make it 1,000 times worse. But I don't think I don't know if people have made the connection yet, because I don't think we're taught the history of why college is so expensive. We just know it's expensive.
Yeah, and there's no free lunch, right? So a lot
Yeah.
of people don't realize that if we promote this idea of like universally affordable education, one thing you learn in economics is that because resources are scarce, because there's not enough, like people always want more of the resources that are out there, they don't have enough. There's going to be competition. Sometimes that competition is price competition, people buying and selling things. That's what we have. I'd say like 90% of the United States, our colleges are still kind of negotiated on price terms. But if you get rid of prices and you get rid of people competing on economic terms, the competition doesn't go away, it's just different. So if you go to a lot of places, a lot of countries where education is like totally free, paid for by the government, the competition that happens there is academic. And so a lot of people can't go to college because they just can't make the cut in terms of the standardized tests and stuff. Like this is like the Chinese system. You don't have to pay a whole lot of money to get into college, but it's decided by like 14 if you're actually even allowed to go to college, right? You have to ration on some angle. And so, yeah, you can ask for free education all day long, but that doesn't mean the competition is going to go away.
That's crazy.
Right. I think that even more than students, probably universities are probably happier at the idea of debt cancellation, because they will be allowed to skyrocket tuition prices. They could double it, triple it.
Absolutely.
It would not even matter. It would literally not even matter. It's the same argument that like people like Nina Turner or AOC make when they're like $20 minimum wage, $30 minimum wage. Why not 60? Why not 100? Like, where does it
Every year
end?
it
Why
goes
would it
up.
ever end? Literally, why would it ever end if you could raise it to any arbitrary amount? And people will say, well, the cost of living has inflated. Like, why can't we, cancel debt or raise minimum wage? And I would just make the argument that you can't cancel debt. That's a fallacy. It's only transferred. Somebody's going to owe it. Like you said, Peter, there's no such thing as free lunch. It'll get transferred. We'll all have to pay for it. And yeah, it'll just go on the backs of hardworking people, blue collar people, people who never went to college or never took out loans in the first place or already paid back their loans. I don't understand. I mean, I would be so mad if I took out $100,000 and paid it back over time, made sacrifices to pay that back, maybe held off on buying a house or getting a mortgage to pay that back. And then the next generation of people has it all forgiven. And then the argument I see being made is, well, just because you had a bad doesn't mean we have to have it bad too. You're such a boomer for that. Da, 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 da. And I've made the argument before, I think in the SVB episode or one of the previous episodes, that boomers were probably the first American generation to leave their children and offspring worse off than before. But we're going to do something even worse. I mean, the Social Security is nothing. Social Security is nothing compared to if we cancel student debt and socialize healthcare like Generation Z wants to do. And I'm extremely scared for our future and our children's future.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of children, Peter, I know that you have several, and I know you also work heavily with population. Could you explain to us what your work within that sector of economic research is about?
Yeah, so I was kind of I'm always intrigued by when people make cases for things that go against what is like common knowledge. Especially when you recognize in yourself that you have like absorbed through osmosis of the culture or something, like some beliefs that you've never critically examined. And so one of those really common beliefs that like if you just ask people on the street, 90% of people will tell you, if you ask them, well, what do you think about the population? People will just say, oh, well, the earth is overpopulated. Like this is just like a really popular belief that like there's all sorts of variations of this. There's too many people, we need less people. And this is something that I used to believe too. It's just something that like you kind of absorb going through life. I don't know when it's told to everybody or when it just kind of happens naturally.
K-12.
Yeah, K through 12 is probably Earth Day when we got our little trees and the population was mentioned. Sure. And one I read the work of an economist who's now passed away, Julian Simon. He had this massive book called The Ultimate Resource where he went through every possible objection and he pointed out all the data indicates that the world is environmentally and resource-wise better than it's ever been, not just in spite of a larger population, but in part because of higher population. Simon's argument is that people's minds are a resource that have increased the abundance of everything around us more than anything else on the planet. And so part of what I look at is researching along that line, looking at how the human mind, especially through things like entrepreneurship, can actually make things more abundant than they are in the economy now. And another track I take too related to this is I'm bothered by the fact that, especially in the 20th century, but even up to today, there was a lot of resources, energies, whatever you want to call it, invested in lowering the population because of this kind of academia, ivory tower belief that the world was overpopulated, sprang out of like a lot of ecology departments and stuff like that. And so both within the US and in other countries, a lot of money was spent trying to decrease populations. And when you take the Julian Simon argument seriously, when you look at the data and see people are actually good for the environment, this is like the worst possible policy. Not only are you pretty significantly harming human rights, but you're also making things worse environmentally and economically when you do it. And so kind of examining that in my research and the history of those sorts of things is very interesting to me.
That's fascinating. Have you heard of the antinatalist trend?
Oh, yeah. The antinatalists have been around for a long time. In fact, you can go back to mid-1900s. You had people intentionally coining the phrase child-free instead of childless. Right. This is probably something that if you haven't thought about it very much, you may not have noticed. But people used to be described as childless if they didn't have children. If they didn't have children. But now they're described as child-free. Right. And so like there's minor language modifications.
So there's some freedom associated with having
free.
No children.
Yeah. So
that's
a
interesting.
Little Chelsea Handler moment.
That's right. Yeah.
I've pretty much only heard child-free. So that's interesting that there was that switch over to kind of, I don't know, just make it more appealing in the mind to not have children. And I absolutely don't think everyone needs to have kids. I think there's a lot of people who probably shouldn't have kids just by the way they act and their maturity level and stuff. Like
maybe they become more mature once they do have kids. There is an argument to be made there that people like really, once they're responsible for other human beings, they become more responsible.
And I've definitely seen that happen, but I feel like today, just the access to the internet has exposed me to the most extreme types of people. Like if you're ever scrolling on libs of TikTok or anything, you're like, yeah, these people should probably never procreate, like, ever. But I have seen the flip side where somebody who I consider to be like kind of immature growing up had a kid and they totally transformed. So I think that's certainly possible. Peter, do you get antinatalists or just people like judgmental for you having a family relatively young in age?
Sometimes people are surprised by my age, and so I would say that like I haven't experienced any like virulence like, oh, kids are the worst, but I do like have people who I know in my life who are committed to like never having kids, who the world is a worse place for the decision that they've made. Now, maybe you're not obligated to always do the thing that's like best for the world to your own detriment in every single angle. Sometimes, but I do think that like people haven't internalized the kind of the antinatalist sentiment more so than like people expressing it about other people. I've never had someone say, oh, you have like too many kids or anything like that. But I have had people say, oh, when did you have your first kid? 22? Like that's really young, and it's like, oh yeah, it's good. It was a good time. So.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking about this briefly before we started filming, and it was just such a good, juicy topic. So a lot of these population studies have also occurred in China because of their one-child policy, which I believe is now a two-child policy. And I have been on this kick recently that conservatives should stop posting war propaganda, that China is this big, powerful creature that's going to take over the world, because there are a lot of cracks in China that make them very weak despite what we see constantly. And one of those things is that they restricted people from having more than one child, which also led to a gender imbalance, which is leading to less children. And now there is a small workforce supporting a very aging population. What are the ramifications of that for China's economy?
Yeah, so I want to start off first with like kind of some interesting kind of facts about the one-child policy that people might not know, because I do like to highlight that unfortunately the one-child policy at least was in part Western influence. The left is always very concerned about neocolonialism. Well, here's some neocolonialism for you. The one-child policy was inspired by a group called the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome was a kind of several different universities, but was spearheaded by a few groups outside university in the United States. And they were really looking at population problems. They were some of these people like ringing the doomsday bell that the world's going to fall apart because of population growth. And their projections, which were very bad projections because they basically said the world was going to be over in the year 2000. And so you can look around and it was a bad projection. Their projections were used by a Chinese missile scientist. He sort of like retrofitted their, different calculations and projections they made to craft the one-child policy. And so it was a combination of the Chinese military-industrial complex and kind of Western academia that came together and was at least in part responsible for the one-child policy. And then after the one-child policy was implemented, the United Nations of all groups gave China an award for population activities. So the first United Nations Fund for Populations Activity Award was given to China and India, both of whom were engaging in coercive population policies. India is less well known, but they were sterilizing men and women across the country against their will. Yeah. And that was, a lot of Western influence as well over there. And so this anti-population idea has really had these negative effects even in other countries. And so that's kind of some of the history of the one-child policy. But Maggie, I agree with you 100%. China has tried to perfectly plan their economy, and that involves planning the population. In fact, Mao Zedong's comment was he didn't want the anarchy of human production to destroy China, and so it needed to be planned like the economy. And so this was straight like, let me apply Marx to population. Now, there's some interesting stuff that Marx and Engels were actually more pro-population, but Mao took it to its logical conclusion. He said, well, if we need to plan production, that means we need to plan the number of producers, right? This obvious implication of centrally planned economy is you need to have a number of workers that you can know and plan. And so the one-child policy was the result of this. And the problem with centrally planned economies is they actually ignore the knowledge of the people on the ground. And so a lot of people do need to have children for various reasons, especially, for example, in developing countries. A really common reason people have children is for social security, right? If you don't have an advanced social security system, one of the reasons that people will have lots of kids is that the kids can take care of you when you're older. In a country with zero social safety nets, either from government or even in your community, people aren't wealthy enough to just like lift you out of poverty because they don't have enough themselves. The only way to handle this is to, have a family that's going to take care of you. For better or for worse, that's what needs to happen. And so China's going to face this problem of an aging population, that they're going to have a lot of people who need to be taken care of and not a lot of people to take care of them, because not only did so many people in China get to have one child, but because of the culture being more focused around men at the time of one-child policy, there were a lot of attempts to abort all female babies, or to even, there was infanticide of female babies, because if you only get one child and it ends up being a woman who can't work in China at the time, this was a big problem for families. And so this led to this phenomenon called the missing women phenomenon in China, where the sex ratio is totally out of balance. There aren't enough women for men anymore. And so this is a compound problem. So not only do you not have enough people, you've got an upside down population pyramid, more older people than younger people, but this younger people group can't make enough people because there's not women around in China, or at least to the extent that they should be. And so China's going to face a really big problem. There was a recent economic paper put out, I believe, by the National Bureau of Economic Research that showed aging populations, even in the U.S., lead to per year something like 0.3% lower economic growth. And that may sound really small, but again, 0.3% over hundreds of years, that's millions and millions of dollars of difference for people. And so it actually is massive. Yeah, I think China has sowed the seeds of their own destruction, kind of like the Soviet Union did throughout the 70s. I really think that
and our propaganda about the Soviet Union was very similar to the way it is about China right now. And now in hindsight, we say, oh, they were so weak, they were falling apart. I really feel that's what we're going to say about China, and I think the one-child policy has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, a famous moment in the history of economic thought, Paul Samuelson was kind of the guy in terms of mainstream economics textbooks. He had won the Nobel Prize in economics, very popular economist, very well regarded, and he was putting in his new edition of his textbook every year for like 20 years. Next year will be the year the Soviet Union overtakes the United States. Next year. Because look at these numbers. Look at all the growth.
It's like when the world is going to end.
Yeah, that's right.
It's going to be 2035 now.
Yeah, and
we can only hope.
And he never updated to say like, oh, my forecast is less, good. It's just 1 year the Soviet Union collapsed, and then it became obvious. Well, that's not going to happen. And so I agree with you. China today seems to me a lot like the Soviet Union of the 70s and 80s. They're going to appear very scary and very large and like the next big thing. But they have sort of laid this all on a terrible foundation.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. Maybe for the future of freedom. Like I worry for the people in China, but the hope is that once their government goes away, that they can build something that actually celebrates their freedom and upholds it. Because gosh, it's real bad over there. Either way, I think this is a great place to wrap. Olivia, do you have any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say before we leave, Peter, I know I'm not asking you to give financial advice, but just something to say to, a lot of our audience base is younger. I know there's a lot of people who listen who relate to, dropping out of school or really not knowing what to do to kickstart their career or to protect their assets or what risks to take, for what reward. Is there a certain, I guess, background or philosophy or just like a simple message you can give to those types of people, like, on what to do?
Yeah, I think the best advice for people who don't have like a really strong like family background in managing money is the idea that you should really not take on a lot of consumer debt. Like this is maybe the biggest hack that you can have, is that you shouldn't be using your credit card to like buy things like, game systems or junk food, things like that, because that interest on the credit card is going to get you for a really long time. It's okay to take on debt, and this is a good rule in life in general. It's okay to take on debt so long as that debt is going to be productive for you. And so you have to live somewhere. It's not a bad idea to have a mortgage because you're going to be paying rent somewhere anyways. And so taking on debt by itself is not bad. But if I was giving like any sort of like hacks for life in terms of things, don't overspend on things that you enjoy, that, you know, these consumer goods. Those will come back to get you and really hurt you for the long term.
That is great advice. Thank you so much.
My biggest flex is I have good credit. So I agree with everything you just said.
Well, either way, you guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I loved this episode. This was a great conversation. Peter, where can we point people to find you on social media?
Absolutely. So I am on Twitter at Peter Pashute. That's all one word, and it's PeterPashute. So that's at Peter Pashute. And then you can also find me on FEE's website, fee.org. If you go to the stories tab, there'll be something for me that week. And also I have a personal website. It's Peter-Jacobsen, JACOBSEN.com. So Peter-Jacobsen.com.
Awesome. And Olivia, where can we find you?
As always, I'm at Twitter at Rondeau Olivia and on Instagram at Rondeau.Olivia.
And you can find me on Twitter at Liberty Anders. Thank you guys so much for tuning in again. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave us a comment, and we can't wait to see you next week. Bye.